On and on the great river rolls, racing east. Of proud and gallant heroes, its white tops leave no trace. As right and wrong, pride and fall, turn all at once unreal. Yet ever the green hills stay, to blaze in the west waning day. Fishers and woodsmen comb the river aisles. White crowned, they've seen enough of spring and autumn tide to make good company over the wine jar, where many a famed event provides their merriment. The empire, long divided, must unite. Long united, must divide. Thus it has ever been. Episode 1, Not So Mellow Yellow. Hello, we are very excited to welcome you all to the first episode of Discourse of the Three Kingdoms, our brand new podcast. My name is Steve and I'm your host. However, some of you may know me better as Sun Fin. Today, I'm going to be joined by Jude, who is a regular panelist on the show. Alongside the two of us, we've also got a special guest. Aaron, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Aaron, better known to some of you as Yue Fei from the Koi forums. I've been interested and involved in Three Kingdoms history for over 25 years. First introduced by the Koi game Romance of the Three Kingdoms on the NES. I've been active in all kinds of history forums that are no longer active anymore, that are still active. I was a moderator on Koi, and I had the pleasure of leading the historical discussions there as the head moderator of that board. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm very excited to be here on this podcast.
Thank you. We're delighted you've joined us, Aaron. So in today's episode, we're going to think about some key themes from the first chapter of the historical fiction novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms. These themes will allow us to explore the history behind the narrative. We're encouraging you to read the novel alongside the podcast, as we think that way you will get the most out of our discussions and will be able to follow what's going on in the history more clearly. But just in case you need a reminder, Jude is going to give us a quick recap.
The first chapter of the novel is an introduction to a nation about to descend into civil war. It starts with the Han, a long-lived dynasty still at peace, but increasingly troubled by bad omens and large-scale discontent. And the novel makes it very clear who to blame. Amidst this dissatisfaction with the government, it introduces us to the Zhang brothers. They are the founders of a religious movement, the Yellow Turbans, who develop into a rebellion, plunging the land into war. In the battles between the Yellow Turbans and the government forces, the novel introduces us to its style of warfare, duels and strategy being required to win the day. Thanks to the war, we meet a man of the imperial line, Liu Bei, who makes an oath of brotherhood with Guan Yu and Shang Fei before joining the fight against the Turbans. We meet, in a brief cameo, Cao Cao, a crafty figure of rich background. And though we don't focus on it in this episode, we meet the arrogant general, Dong Zhuo.
Thanks, Jude. Now you're going to introduce us to our first theme.
Our first theme is, as the novel opens, with the Han decline, that after nearly 400 years, things were no longer quite so good for a once glorious dynasty. And a very simple narrative of what has gone wrong. The two emperors had been persuaded by their eunuchs against the common officials, and that the heavens themselves were showing signs via omens that everything was going wrong, that people were suffering. Personally, I think it's a good, simple narrative just for introducing people, not getting people bogged down, that the sense of things are wrong. But I was wondering what the use thoughts, Stephen.
Yeah, I think the whole topic of omens are really interesting. When we think of omens, we probably think that there's natural causes for those things. So some of the omens that are given in that chapter are roosters changing gender and particular weather events and natural disasters. And perhaps our first thought is, Well, obviously that's to do with nature, but you've got to remember that the people of this time were deeply religious, and they would have attached connotations to it. And you may be thinking, well, they didn't; these things didn't happen; they're just being made up later on. But I was struck recently. So we're recording this just a few weeks after the Queen, Queen Elizabeth of England, died, and you may have seen in the news that the day that she died, a rainbow appeared over the palace, literally at the same time. Now, that's probably a coincidence, but it's an amazing coincidence that it happened at that time. And so, if you were living in a culture that didn't have the high view of science that perhaps we have today, you can understand why people were reading more into that. So, I just think the idea, the whole topic of omens is really interesting. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think it's quite fascinating when we're getting into a world that's pre-scientific method. You know, you have to think in their mindset, in their context, to really understand what's going on. Yeah, to them, this was a really big deal. This was, you know, that the heavens have cursed them essentially. The emperors lost the mandate of heaven, and this is a really big deal for them.
I would say that even though we don't believe that sort of an earthquake equals that the government has lost support, but when things are bad, we can take little signs that brings forward more of a sense that just things are wrong. Or minor little things that you would skip over if things were right suddenly become, oh, this is just a bad sign. I would
Yeah,
also
so there is some sense, isn't there, that things were bad, and we can see that there were difficulties in that time, that people were hungry, the court wasn't functioning as it should, and so perhaps they were reading into events and spotting things that always happened, but were more obvious because people were looking for signs that things were bad.
they did believe in omens. They did believe that the heavens showed their displeasure, but omens were also a way for members of the bureaucracy to go, I'm not directly criticizing you, but there was this sign, the stars were slightly out, or there was this earthquake, or this fire that I didn't conveniently light in the palace. That was a way of going, was saying, this is what I think is wrong with the government. This is what is of concern to me. And they did believe, but they could be quite cynical in their use of. And it has been suggested by likes of Rafe de Crespi that some of the fires in the palaces where the Han was in trouble may not have been entirely natural causes. So I think when we think back on past, we must remember that the omens were also a political protection for all sides to be able to go, this is what I feel is wrong without becoming a direct insult to the emperor or his court.
Yeah, so I think that's really helpful. So what this whole talk of omens does in this chapter is communicate to us that there is a disconnect, isn't there, between the court and the people, and something clearly had gone wrong. And whether those omens are actually signs from heaven, as they believed, whether it's people reading too much in, or whether they're even omens that are being man-made to try and prove a political point, what they're really getting at, and what's really important to us as we look at the history, is that we can see that something was deeply wrong at the centre of the Han court.
Following the traditional histories does put the blame on the eunuchs that things had been going fine, but that these strange beings had been allowed control of the court, had to the emperor's ear that they were too favoured. Modern historians tend to point to wider, deeper issues for the Han, that, and the novel fails to mention things like that the eunuchs came to power under Emperor Han because they had helped the emperor get out from under the thumb of a regicide regent, and so he'd backed them. He was grateful to them, and the gentry just did not like that. They did not like this opposition to their power. These goodly men were powerful bureaucrats with their own interests that the eunuchs were now challenging. And so for them, this was an unnatural offence that also was hampering them. And so they strongly opposed. and the novel very much backs, as well for narrative reasons, the emperor should only listen to the members of this bureaucracy, not these strange creatures who are now the result of everything that's going wrong. Any thoughts, Evan?
You've touched on pretty much everything that I would have mentioned, other than it's just a shame that they've been treated this poorly, considering the help that they gave to the emperor. So it's interesting that history doesn't always go in the way that we expect it to. That the people who rendered good service to the emperor to help him out from under the thumb of influential regent, and then they have their name end up disparaged throughout the ages.
And if this is something that you find interesting, this conversation around the units and how they've been treated by history, then we're planning on doing an episode which focuses entirely on them and the turmoil in the court that kind of is the whole backdrop to this period. But we're not going to go into depth on that right now, because actually the fact that there is trouble at court is all we really need to know for the narrative of the history. Our second theme is the Yellow Turbans. This is a topic I find particularly interesting. So who were the Yellow Turbans? Well, they began as a Taoist religious movement with a great deal of emphasis on miraculous healings. They believed that outward illness was a result of hidden wrong. So the way to be healed was to confess your sin. The movement was begun by a man called Zhuo and his two brothers. And this religious movement became popular, especially among the peasantry, and spread through a few provinces in China. And at some point, Zhuo decided to shape his disciples into an army, intending to begin a rebellion. We've already spoken about the discontent at the court, and it shouldn't be a surprise that those same things were causing discontent in the country. But in 184, disaster struck. The plot was uncovered, and they were forced to rebel early, and so the battles began. Jude, what stands out to you about the way the novel presents the Yellow Turbans?
The things I find interesting in the way the novel does it is how Zinger, who's known in Dynasty Warriors as Sang Jiao, but Zinger is thought to be the more accurate pronunciation of the name at the time. It's that he starts off with a fairly good intent to heal people, but that sort of, as he gains more followers, becomes more influential, he forgets his promises and he turns towards rebellion to sort of become a possible emperor himself. I like that journey in the novel, the good man turned by his ambition.
Things don't work out too well for the Yellow Turbans, and so everything that we know about the Yellow Turbans are written by people who religiously and politically disagree with them, and so we don't really know that much about Zhuo other than what was written by his enemies. So I do find that novel presentation really interesting. Jude, there is a song, isn't there, that we read in the novel? It's like the manifesto, isn't it? Are you able to read that for us?
Sure. The pale sky is on the wane. Next, a yellow one shall reign. The calendar's rotation spells fortune for the nation.
Thank you. Erin, are you able to explain what that means, what the pale sky and the yellow sky and those things represent?
Yeah, so this poem is basically referencing the Chinese system of 5 elements called wuxing. So there's wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. It's a very complicated system, but to go into simple terms is wood overcomes fire, fire overcomes earth, earth overcomes metal, and metal overcomes water. So this poem, where it's saying the pale sky, it's talking about the Han government. Now, in the cycle, Han is represented by fire, the color red. So it's a little bit odd here that they're talking about the pale sky, or in some translations, the azure sky.
Interestingly, that's what the historical texts say as well. The quote we have in the history books is azure sky. So the novel is picking up what's there in history, but I don't understand where that's coming from either.
Yes, because azure is, it's the green color. in the elemental cycle, and that's represented by wood. But as we know, the Han is represented by fire, so it's very possible that the Yellow Turbans, are getting this wrong by what color the Han is. It could be that the Han is, using two elemental colors. It's not really well defined during the Han Dynasty, this elemental cycle, but regardless of which way you use, where one generates another, one element generates another, or an element overcomes, earth still comes after wood and fire. So the yellow sky, the yellow one shall reign, is still correct in a sense. So they're just saying that the yellow sky, the yellow turbans are going to take over from the Han government.
Yeah, and so it's a continuation of that Omen theme, isn't it? It's saying that the Han dynasty has lost heaven's favor, and the Yellow Turbans, so represented by the yellow sky, have gained heaven's favor, and they're going to replace the Han dynasty. And what's really interesting is that song is historically accurate. So we might not have those exact words, but words to that effect were scribbled on the walls of the capital city and all over the place, which makes the rebellion really interesting because it means that the Han court knew that there were rebels who were promoting this message that the Han dynasty was due to come to an end and there was going to be a new dynasty rise up in its place. And they didn't appear to do all that much about it, did they, Jude?
No, partly the idea of elements being used to talk about replacing the Han wasn't unknown, but I think for the Han court, the Yellow Turbans for a long time were useful. They were another faith group, of which there are many, in trying to deal with the epidemics that were raging through the land, and that for the Han they could be useful as good teaching, helping solve people's problems that the Han, with its own financial problems, could not solve and could not heal because no one knew how to solve the Antonian epidemic that was spreading throughout the 60s and 70s. So for the Han, it was just, here's a group, yeah, it's really powerful, it's really growing, but hey, it's not hostile as far as we know. And if it tweaks the nose of a few local gentry, well, does it really matter that much? Which certain Han figures themselves shared similar beliefs to the Turbans. Not the whole let's rebel and overthrow the Han, but they would have been sympathetic because their own religious philosophical beliefs was very similar to what they saw as from the Sang brothers.
Yeah, so we start with them as this religious movement, and we see that in the novel, and we see that with Shang-Chi getting followers and doing healings. But as he gets more and more followers, he starts to set them up as armies in different regions, and then suddenly they're going to rebel against the central court. And that's what we see and what we've read in the novel. But the rebellion goes wrong at the vital moment. The plan is betrayed, and the leader at the central court is arrested. In the novel, we're told that he's beheaded. Actually, in real history, it was far more gruesome. His limbs were tied to chariots, and horses were encouraged to run in opposite directions. So he literally got ripped to shreds. Very gruesome. I wouldn't recommend trying that yourself.
Sport.
Yeah, no, please don't do that at home. We don't want to be sued. And so, having found out about the rebellion, having had it betrayed, the Chang brothers have to take up the field before they were ready, which has a negative impact because you've got to remember lots of their followers are peasants and farmers, and so they have to abandon their harvest, and some of them choose not to abandon their harvest because they want to eat for understandable reasons. And then the Han court responds, and they seem to respond really promptly. They appoint 3 commanders and send them out to fight in those key areas where the Yellow Turbans have risen up. And at that point, having told us about the actions, what the novel does is introduce us to a character called Liu Bei. And in our introduction to him, we suddenly go into a lot of depth, which tells us that this guy is going to be a major character.
Liu Bei's a very interesting figure. There's a lot of controversy around him. But to start off, we'll start off with mentioning that he's considered to be a heroic individual by the novel. And while he's not a scholar himself, he is seen to be pro towards the scholars. So he has a connection to Liu Zhe, who is one of the leaders in the court. He's known for his filial piety towards his mother, and this is a big thing in Confucian thought of showing reverence to your parents, and this sets him out to be a heroic individual in the mind of the person that's reading this novel.
Yeah, so
During
everything we're told about him in this chapter is really positive, isn't it? Some of it might feel slightly strange to us. So we're told that he has big ears with earlobes that touch his shoulders and eyes that are so wide that he can see behind him. Now, those are descriptions which to me sound really strange, but they are heroic characteristics. So everything that we're told about Liu Bei in this novel sets him up to be a hero.
the descriptions is a stock literary description of a Buddhist hero. Buddhism was much more prominent during the time that the novel was written. It coalesced quite well with traditional Chinese religion. He's being combined into this ultimate hero by the author Luo Guanzhang. And so we move on as, after his description, his face was flawless as jade, his lips like dabs of rouge. It's a very, very strange picture that you get in your mind when you're reading this.
He's not the only hero we're introduced to in
No,
this chapter, is he?
No, there's two others. So the first other hero that he meets is a man called Zheng Fei. And his description is also quite interesting. And it comes from an earlier work of the novel called the Pinghua. And his description is what you would consider to be a fearsome individual. So he's quite tall. He's got a head that's shaped like a panther's, and he's got big eyes and very, very large jowls with whiskers and a thunderous voice. So this description is like one of a fearsome individual, somebody who is not afraid of anything and can do anything. He's a man's man, as it were. And
So
Liu
whereas Liu Bei
Bei,
is introduced as like the leader, this guy we know straight away is going to be a mighty warrior, don't we?
yes, and Liu Bei is afraid of him at first, and also admiring him. Then the third individual is Guan Yu, and his description is again of a heroic individual, but someone who's more gentlemanly, more honorable in some sense. So he's again exceptionally tall, taller than Zheng Fei, with a very long beard and red cheeks.
Is he who
And
your beard is modelled on, Aaron?
mine's not 2 feet long as the text says. So, but yes, he's quite dashing individual, and his description comes from folklore and Taoist texts, and it conveys a sense of majesty in his description. Again, he's not described as like a leader is, but he's described as this majestic, heroic individual who is an epitome of honorable virtue.
Yeah, and I think the fact that he's the epitome of being a warrior and of honor and all those kind of values is really important. And I suspect that's something we will come back to in later episodes.
I think one interesting thing thought, but the novel, when it's got a big character like this, really likes to build into the description to show these are not ordinary men. But in the history text, a lot of the time you do not have a description of what they look like. Liu Bei is a bit unusual in we do have a bit of descriptions, sort of the long arms, the big ears, which for Zhang Fei we've got nothing. With Guan Yu we've essentially got he's got a beard. Anything else, he could be short, tall, wide. We do not know. And the novel figures, they're models that stand out. You know instantly upon seeing them, not just by the lengthy introductions, but that these are heroes to follow and to watch out for.
Yeah.
And Luo Guangzhong takes these from, a boring, not necessarily boring, but they don't have any description in the novel or in the histories. And he takes it from, a boring, no description individual, what they look like, and he turns them into characters. Because we have to keep in mind that this is a novel. It's written for entertainment. It's written for political purposes. Obviously, we got to keep that in mind. But it's ultimately it's a form of entertainment. It follows the structure of almost like somebody speaking it as a story. Yeah, it needs characters.
I think that idea of this being a narrative and it being fiction and it's setting these three characters up is really helpful as we think about what happens next in the novel. So what happens after these three people meet is they straight away, because this is what I normally do when I meet someone for the first time, I go and swear eternal brotherhood with those people, because that's a normal thing to do when you've met someone for 5 minutes. But that's what happens in the novel. But actually, that isn't what happened in history, is it, Jude?
They knew each other for. We don't quite know when they knew each other, but Liu Bei had been gathering supporters, and by the time of the turbans, Guan Yu and Zhang Fei were two of his biggest supporters. But in the novel, what a true heroic leader instantly bonds and recognizes great men just in that moment, and someone who's not quite so heroic a leader may go, I need to know you a bit better before I trust you. I'm a bit suspicious of this new guy. But instead, Liu Bei instantly, just because these three are such heroic figures, they instantly connect. They know, they feel they can trust each other with their lives. And their bond is both historically and novel, such a driving force in their lives. It's something that will become renowned throughout the ages.
Yeah, so although they don't actually swear an oath to eternal brotherhood in history, there is a reason why
As far as we know.
as far as we know, yeah. So it's
Yes.
not mentioned in any historical record, but they were incredibly close. They were incredibly loyal to each other, and we really do see that loyalty driving their actions throughout the next 120 chapters. So we will see why there is a basis for that claim.
Mentioning the Peach Garden Oath, let's segue into what the oath actually says in the novel. We three, though of separate ancestry, join in brotherhood here, combining strength and purpose to relieve the present crisis. We will perform our duty to the Emperor and protect the common folk of the land. We dare not hope to be together always, but hereby vow to die the selfsame day. Let shining heaven above and the fruitful land below bear witness to our resolve. May heaven and man scourge whoever fails this vow. It's some pretty powerful words.
It's a big commitment, isn't it?
It is. Even it's not even really a paragraph, and yet there's been plays that have been made that just for this one event.
It's
and
one of the most iconic scenes in the whole book, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Everyone who encounters Liu Bei, Zhang Fei, and Guan Yu mentions the Peach Garden Oath after this point. They become quite famous because of this event in the novel. It's not very different from the oaths of brotherhood that are made in another novel written by the same individual called Outlaws of the Marsh. There's lots of sworn brotherhood oaths in that novel as well. And it appears that it may have been a common thing that was done during the period that the novel was actually written. So the people that are reading this in this time, they're recognizing that this is, you know, this is something that ties people together in a period where, you know, family ties are not necessarily as strong as they ought to be.
And sworn brotherhood is something that did happen in this period as well. I can think of at least two people in the Three Kingdoms who we know did swear brotherhood to each other. So it was something that was also going on in the period. We just don't know for certain these three did.
But they might as well, whether it actually happened or not. The bond was such that it was, even in state discussions, people used that when talking about Liu Bei.
Okay, so in the novel, having sworn the oath to each other, they get given some weapons. Now, weapons is one of Aaron's passions. So talk to us about the weapons they're given, Aaron.
All right, so this is an interesting little event. So in the novel, Liu Bei gets a pair of double-edged swords. That's, you know, that's nothing. There's nothing that really stands out from that other than, you know, he's got two Jian. It doesn't really get talked about much. Historically, there's not really a problem with it other than using two weapons at the same time was not really that common.
You can tell how insignificant that's been through history in that Koei only gave him double swords in Dynasty Warriors 7. Up until that point, he just had the single sword. So you can see how little impact that's had on historical, on people's thought historically, which is quite different to the next two weapons, isn't it?
Yes, Guan Yu gets a weapon that didn't exist during the Han Dynasty. The novel calls it a green dragon crescent moon blade. In Chinese would be Qinlong Yanyue Dao, weighing 82 jin. So that's jin is a weight during this period, and essentially his weapon is described over 120 pounds. That again is a literary device to denote that this guy is very strong. No natural born human could realistically use a weapon that weighs that much in battle. That have ever been discovered through archaeology have all weighed between, you know, about 1 pound to about the maximum range for very heavy training weapons would be, you know, in the 10-15 pound range. So then Zhang Fei gets a weapon that is an 18 span serpent spear. Now, I'm going to go into this little biography that was written by an individual called Professor Xiao Yunyang. He's one of the department heads at Denison University of Asian Studies. He wrote this quite a long time ago when China History Forum was still active. And it's about an individual from the fall of Western Jin named Chen Han. So there's this little blurb from his biography saying, left with only 10 or so elite cavalrymen, Chen Han fought his last desperate battle with the Xiongnu. He certainly put up a remarkable fight. In his left hand, he wielded a long single-edged sword, 7 chi long. In his right hand, he wielded a serpentine spear, 1 zhang and 8 chi long. So these lengths. So the 7 chi long sword is about 1.68 meters during that time. So it's, you know, it's a long 2-handed sword that would be considered a glaive or a polearm. The 1 zhang and 8 chi long spear is 4.34 meters. So this is 16 foot long spear. That's pretty normal for spears at this time, especially for cavalrymen. And we'll go into Dr. Yang's little assessment. So he writes, the story of Chenong is very likely a model for the image of Zhang Fei and Guan Yu in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. The 1 zhang and 8 chi serpentine spear is easily recognizable, while the 7 chi longsword was interpreted as a glaive, a Yanyue Dao by Yuan and Ming writers, because the value of 7 chi had increased to at least 2.15 meters by their time. This was made all the more confusing by the popular use of the term Da Dao to refer to the Yanyue Dao by Ming times. So in Han times, a Da Dao is just literally a big sword. He continues on, since neither Guan Yu nor Zhang Fei are identified with any specific weapon in the Sanguozhi, which is the histories, it seems likely that the writers in later times looked back to sources that were as contemporaneous as possible to see what they might have used. Chen An of the Western Jin had 2 cool weapons that fit the bill perfectly. So this is sort of the image that we get of, of Zheng Fei and Guan Yu having these interesting, unique, heroic weapons.
So we don't think in
whole-
history they actually wielded anything like these weapons. They are just there to tell us that they're heroic characters who are going to be mighty warriors. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, historically, it's very possible that he could have had the same sort of longsword that Chen An used. That's not out of the realm of possibility. And again, Zhang Fei having a serpent spear, which at this time was, it didn't actually look like a serpent. It wasn't wavy or anything. The whole point of the name was it was long and slender and fast. And that's why it was called a serpent spear. So there's nothing that says that Zhang Fei couldn't have used this because these weapons did exist, at the end of at the fall of the Western Jin, which is not too far from the Han Dynasty in comparison to, say, 900 years where the Yanyue Dao exists during the Song Dynasty. But more likely they had, a lance, a sword, a bow, and then they had their armor, lamellar armor, which for the brothers at this time, it wouldn't have been quite advanced armor. They're just starting out. They're just, getting into the things, but it still would have afforded them quite a bit of protection, and they would have had more armor than any any of the troops that they're facing off against. Yeah.
Well, all of this is kind of communicated. Everything about this introduction, from their appearance to anecdotes about their life up until this point, to the weapons they've been given, to the oath that they swear, is to present these 3 as the heroes of this time period. And that's what we're going to see throughout our exploration through the history. The novel wants us to present to us that these 3 are the heroes. So after this introduction, we get to see them in action, don't we? We see them in their very first battle. Jude, do you want to talk to us about that?
One thing the novel does very, very quickly once they get to battle is show how the novel is going to portray battles. You open up with Guan Yu and Zhang Fei getting their first kills, and the poem for it by going into duels that battles can be won by martial might. The skilled and brave warriors will be key to any warlord. But then the next battle, when they go into Xing province to help out, they're outnumbered, so they have to use strategy, luring the enemy into an ambush, and it's those 2 factors. Instead of organization or strong leadership, it's about the might of warriors who can quickly slay the other commanders, or heroic fighting through the enemy ranks, or clever strategies that will break the enemy. And it's very effective for literary terms and as to making entertaining battles. And it basically set up how the novel is going to handle the fights in the future by just the 2 opening battles.
And it's quite helpful because actually Chinese historians weren't all that interested in the military history aspect. They're interested in the political history and the fallout from the battles, but actually we have very few descriptions of battles themselves. And so we don't actually know how many of these battles were fought. We just know that this battle happened, and then we're told about the consequences of that battle for political or religious or social reasons. So the novelist was able to have quite a lot of fun because he didn't have all that much material to use. So he was able to write about it however he wanted, really. And whilst we're talking about a literary device, this is how the battles are are fought in the novel, I think it's helpful to say that what we read in the novel about the battles that are fought, as in who's fighting who, is fairly accurate. This is how the campaign took place. The one deviation is, of course, Liu Bei and his brothers weren't at many of these battles. Isn't that right?
Yeah, as far as we know in the official histories, he's not. He doesn't really partake much in the putting down the Yellow Turban rebellion. It's mentioned that he raised a volunteer regiment, but taking a front and center stage like the novel has him, it's just not there in the histories.
Generally, the novel will follow a historical structure and then add fiction around it. So you've got, so while it's changed the three Sang brothers as the three Yellow Turban commanders across the fronts, most of the three battle areas the novel will cover were real. The one fiction is the Qing province one, which didn't rise up at the time. But Liu Bei makes a great person for the novel to go. As Liu Bei dashes around in the novel, it can then go, and here's this fight over here, and news comes in. It's an effective literary device, but it does give Liu Bei a very prominent role, rather than a sort of more localized junior officer role.
And perhaps it takes credit away from other people. Going to throw that out there, but
it does introduce the other individuals, though. Like, it does introduce Liu Yan, it does introduce Lu Zhi and Huang Fu Song. It doesn't completely take away the credit, but he does kind of get the limelight in the novel.
Yeah, he dominates this revolt, which
he does. Yeah. Of course, there is one other significant figure that the novel introduces in this chapter and gives some credit to, and that's Cao Cao. And I think Jude is going to talk to us a bit about Cao Cao, aren't you?
Cao Cao's role against the Turbans is a brief cameo, and be honest, that's fair enough. He turns up as reinforcements for Hong Fusong and Suzhen, and so has a slightly longer role, but he's pulled out early to govern an area that had become troublesome for the Han in the light of the Turban Rebellion. But the novel, though it's brief, then delves into him to show him as a hero, and again, it gives him an appearance. He's
a
tall.
Hero? Are you sure?
Hero in terms of a mighty figure to follow, but sort of, he's tall, which is somewhat with heroic appearance. Though again, like Guan Yu and Sang Fei, we don't know much about Cao Cao's actual appearance. If anything, stories close to the time suggest he may have been while a charismatic presence, he may have been rather short and was a little shy on that.
So whilst everything we're told about Liu Bei is really positive, like everything we're told is a really positive anecdote, with Cao Cao, his introduction in the novel is a little bit more mixed, isn't it? Yeah. So we get told the story about his relationship with his uncle. His uncle doesn't like him. Or no, it's not he doesn't like him. His uncle doesn't trust him, ultimately. And he's telling his dad, so Cao Cao's uncle is telling Cao Cao's dad to watch him more carefully. And Cao Cao has a great idea. So he pretends to have a fit on the ground, and his uncle runs to tell his dad. His dad comes, and Cao Cao says, "I've never had a fit. I think what's going on is my uncle's making stuff up about me," which means that he can then get away with whatever he wants because his uncle is no longer believed when it comes to stories about him. Now, that shows Cao Cao's cunning and his intelligence, but it also shows he's not entirely honest. And so it's a mixed introduction to Cao Cao, isn't it? That's what we get in this chapter.
The novel does a good job in sort of going, this is a figure to follow, but whereas Liu Bei, it makes a big deal about his Han lineage, a really big deal. With Cao Cao, it talks about he's the grandson of a eunuch, whereas Liu Bei is filial and...
How does that work? How can you be a grandson of a eunuch, Jude?
By the miracle of birth. Or, in this case, the grandfather adopted the son to continue his line, which is one of those practices the emperor started allowing, which really annoyed the gentry, because the whole point of being eunuch is they couldn't have children, and so this was unnatural. Though adoption was a regular way of keeping lineages going, in this case it wasn't fatal for Cao Cao. he was a member of the elite. He was still a rich man, but it was a slight negative to his background that the novel is happy to remind people that whereas Liu Bei is this imperial descendant, Cao Cao is someone with a slightly less glamorous, less perfect background.
And even in history, that works out, doesn't it? Like Cao Cao is privileged. He has advantageous starting point. He has money behind him. He has influence and power, but we can tell he's still not the top tier of nobility. We will meet a character shortly called Yuan Shao, who is that like his family are the most prominent family and have been the most prominent family in China for generations, except for the royal family themselves. And Cao Cao's not quite that level.
Yeah.
So although his background helps him, it is not like he is the elite of the elite. And that's what I think the novel is trying to communicate to us. I mean, I don't think it's a spoiler to say that Cao Cao is the giant whose shadow covers this period. He is probably the most significant person in terms of the historical events. So he is someone that we're going to be keeping a close eye on as we follow through history.
It's kind of interesting how well it contrasts Liu Bei and Cao Cao right from the start. Liu Bei he's filial, Cao Cao deceives his uncle and his father. Liu Bei is kind and gets to know great men. Cao Cao is quite strict. He's clearly a talented man and sort of on the rise, but he's already someone that you wouldn't necessarily trust to have your back entirely.
And that goes even into the novel's description of his his childhood name, Anan. Just mentioning that in this is kind of offensive in a way. It's meant to be offensive because having outsiders, meaning people outside your family, refer to you by your childhood name is it's disparaging. It's rude. You're not supposed to call someone by their childhood nickname. But the interesting thing is that this name means little deceiver, essentially.
It's what every child wants to call their son.
Yeah. Every child wants to call their son.
Every father wants to call their son.
It's a derogatory nickname, isn't it? It's not something that I would want to be referred to as.
So it's entirely possible that this childhood name is not actually a real thing.
It's fictional.
It comes from a hostile source in the histories, and it's entirely possible. It is in the history, so we have to still take that it did exist in the period from contemporary writings.
Everyone touches on something that's good that whereas the novel with Liu Bei, it takes what the records say about Liu Bei and slightly exaggerates it to show how good a man.
Positively.
Yeah. With Cao Cao, it's drawing upon generally hostile sources rather than the ones Cao Cao's family would rather prefer to come to light, like how he opposed his corruption, how he'd been neglected at court, his scholarship at this time. But
so it spins him negatively, doesn't it?
But Cao Cao was, I think we can call it a man about town, sort of rich, wealthy, untouchable. And so there are quite a few stories in either the records or sort of early fictional stories about Cao Cao sort of not quite getting up to japes, I think we could call it. Like going into the leading eunuch Zhang Rang's house and causing trouble, then scaring off the guards with his nimbleness and skill with a sword, and that the eunuch guards were probably going, this is just going to cause me so much trouble if I kill him.
There's some other stories where, him and his friends crash a wedding, and then they take the bride and all the maids away, and this is from a folktale. So it's just he's a man that isn't at the top, but he's not at the bottom like Liu Bei. And he's effectively he does whatever he wants, and he doesn't suffer any kind of repercussion.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, isn't it? So although Liu Bei is a member of the imperial family, he's related very distantly, and we should emphasize the very distantly, to the emperor. His particular branch of the family have fallen on hard times, so he's actually really poor, and his imperial name doesn't do him all that much good, despite how the novel presents it. For quite some way, he has to get through the early part of his career basically on sheer talent and unbelievable charisma. And so although Liu Bei has the advantage of a good name, Cao Cao has the disadvantage of a bad name associated with the eunuchs. Cao Cao's background is actually more helpful to him initially than Liu Bei's is, because Liu Bei's background only comes into fruition when he's already managed to gain some success and people are already looking to him as a figure. And then they think, oh, you're related to the imperial family. That's wonderful. That kind of validifies what he's already achieved, doesn't it? So Liu Bei is at the bottom and Cao Cao is near the top of the hierarchy. So the novel, having introduced Cao Cao, ends in a really interesting place. So we again see the corruption of the court. A general called Liu Xi has been fighting battles, has been relatively successful, but he refuses to pay a bribe to the central court. So he's carted off, and a new general comes in called Zhuo, who is a very significant figure who we're going to be thinking about quite a bit in the next few episodes. And Zhuo doesn't do very well in this battle, according to the novel, which is interesting because actually he was a very talented military commander. He has many faults and many flaws, and we will touch on them greatly, but military success is not one of them. But the novel ends with him having upset Zhang Fei because Liu Bei comes back, he wins a great battle, but because Liu Bei doesn't have any rank and no official status, Zhuo doesn't give them any respect. And so Zhang Fei is furious and he wants to go cut Zhuo's head off, and we get a poem about that, which Jude will now read for us.
Status is what counts and always has. Who needs to honor heroes without rank? Oh, let me have a sang face straight and true, who'll pay out every ingrate what he's due. So obviously kill your boss is what the novel is saying.
Yeah. So as Jude just said, clearly what the novel was advocating is if you don't like your boss, go kill them. However, that's not what we as hosts are advocating, because we don't want to get in trouble. And that brings us to the end of our first chapter and our first official podcast. We hope that you've had fun. We hope that you've enjoyed learning with us. And we hope you'll join us again for episode 2. But for the time being, it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Did Zhang Fei kill the Imperial Corps commander? Well, you're going to have to listen next time. See you later.